Did you know that starting now, or has been for a few years now, is that more and more funds are allowing average investors to join into private equity? Let me explain. Because a lot of people say that private equity is the root of a lot of the wealth inequality. And you're right. It's because it had to be started by people who had a ton of money, which then had that money compounding. Well, what's happening right now in the US is actually shocking. Is that regulations are starting to be loosened on private equity to allow the average investors to be able to go into private equity, which means you could get up to like 20% compounding return rates. I mean, it sucks because nobody talks about how good investments are. I mean, the investment industry is only going to get better, and AI is not going to replace investments. It never will. It's the human intuition and the mission that we're going to achieve something better that only works in investments. And from the book I'm reading right now, The Holy Grail of Investing, Tony Robbins makes a good point about democratization. And actually, also in the first chapter, he talks about how trillions have already flowed into private markets. I mean, private markets are starting to take over public markets because there are less regulations. With a public company, you have to release all these different things, shareholder stuff, and everything. But what's so good about private markets? Well, part of it is also because of the regulation, but also because in private equity, the companies who, like the investment funds who invest in the private equity, they have more control over what's going on in the company than public shareholders, because in public companies there's way too many shareholders that control actually gets diluted. But is control good? It actually is, because the people who fund those private equity funds have control over where the money or stuff that happens with the money goes, because they choose to fund them and then they put the money in and do that. Well, more and more, because of really the Trump administration, that I think is pretty good, is that they're starting to loosen regulations on investing, which as an argument is actually kind of stupid that I'm even saying it, but loosening regulation is pretty good because a lot of these regulations have actually been lobbied by companies to reduce the access of private equity in these different things, because they've had so much control over where all this money is allocated, which is really why the wealth inequality gap started, is because we have such terrible regulations and tax laws. And if we start allowing the average investor to put money into private equity funds, I think that the wealth inequality gap is going to shrink, especially if the government, or at least state-owned pension funds, start investing into private equity. Man, I think it's going to make such a big difference in the way people are able to retire in ways that you might not even think are possible. And really, what's so good about private equity is that they fund innovation. They fund the actual innovation that drives all these companies. I mean, the largest companies in the world, they were funded by some form of private equity, venture capital, different things. Like maybe somebody had an angel investor, which, I mean, like Shark Tank basically. They have a guy that owns a pretty big chunk who puts money to start, and he gets his network and everything. But the fact that more and more of our regulations are being democratized because of people are starting to wake up to the kind of nonsense going on in the government, which I like, because as regulation starts to become more democratized, especially in the US, the UK, I don't know, they got some shenanigans going on over there. I don't like everything they're doing there. But I think really to bridge the gap in wealth inequality, I think is the thing that caused wealth inequality is gonna help bridge the gap with wealth inequality, which is kind of funny because As soon as you democratize private equity and allow more people to actually buy in, not only could that achieve a higher return rate, but that also just makes the country better. And not only that, but even though capital gains tax is such a low tax, it's responsible for most of the taxes in the United States. It funds so much of the federal government, the capital gains does. And you don't pay state tax, which, I mean, it's unfortunate, but how does that actually help? Well, if you can get the average person to have lower tax in their investments, that's good. And especially since a person who isn't making a crap load of money and able to invest in stuff is paying a ton of taxes. But now, more private equity is going into 401ks and stuff where you can actually deduct that off your taxes and make an ass load of money. That's starting to become more democratized. I don't think it's right versus left. I think it's central thinking, and it's unfortunate because politics took over something that should have never been political. And we need more bipartisan bills because this stuff can't last forever. It needs to be more democratized. And it's unfortunate that there are some socialist policies where they're making the government more institutionalized. I don't necessarily agree with that because if you give more power to the people, that will do such wonders you won't even realize, even though media companies usually control people's opinions, which sucks, but that's the reality we live in. But if you give the people that ability of democratization in the monetary system, which for a long time has been run by private equity and public companies that people haven't really been able to buy into, that now is starting to be more democratized. I mean, in 2020, they allowed anyone with the series licenses for investing to become a accredited investor. I mean, this stuff is amazing that nobody talks about. And I want to help more people, especially my age. Like, I'm 19 and with college students, I want to help people make money in investments. And that's only going to happen through democratization that really is unfortunate in politics because it's so divisive. But I think it starts with reading more books. And I'm going to keep sharing more stuff from books because I think it's such an important thing that people need to learn. And I realized in college that not many people in college ever read books, like, at all. Like, none. Even in English class, some people just chat GPT'd and cheated on it, the projects. I think it starts with reading more books, man. I mean, this book is great, The Holy Grail of Investing. I have no affiliate or anything. I don't need to get rich off of you. I think it starts with helping people. Because if I help people who don't have money start building wealth, I'm going to receive that through the increased standard of living and innovation without even me putting money in. That people need to understand. When you make an investment, you increase everybody else's standard of living by driving innovation. But what actually negates that is the property market. Now, I want to explain a little bit, but I want to make an entire new video of it. But basically, what made the US so good is that the frontier expansion and how the people who were rich, they owned a good amount of land and stuff and they controlled it and they didn't want to sell it. But in the early time of the US, people were able to expand westward, the westward expansion, to basically leave the rich person who's basically monopolized the area to then go somewhere else and explore and start owning some property. The problem that is happening now is that now the entire land is owned and that there's still a huge property market. But the thing that sucks is in these cities where it's becoming more and more narrow and more people and more opportunity exist in such a finite space, eventually the compound interest gets so big for some of these investors that they can just buy up a huge portion, which is unfortunate. But how can you really be a part of this and actually be a part of this insane compound interest. It really starts with investments that you don't even need to buy a house, even a real estate investment trust, which are publicly owned, that actually allow you to get real estate appreciation and real estate dividends. Bonkers. And investments like these need to be talked about, and like especially allowing anybody to own real estate without needing to be rich, I think is only going to make the world better. And the democratization of really private assets is only going to make the world a better place. I don't like it when people say that wealth inequality is only going to get worse because of government policies. I think if you reduce regulation, but also still have a lot of regulation in place to allow people to do this stuff, it's only going to make the world better. And I hope you learned something from this because I just want to make it a better thing for people to invest. It's really just about helping.